And he's like, don't worry, you'll be able to like repay me one day, just not with money.
Yeah.
What did that mean?
Okay, so we are talking about the second half of this book. It's called Like Happiness by Ursula Villarreal-Moura. Yeah, let's talk about the second half of this book. Like, oh my God, the reveal. The reveal, Heather.
Reveal. Also, the title of this book, like, always was good because the book was happiness that Tatum always loved. But with the reveal, it has this like extra level that feels almost like icky. So anyways, I'm obsessed. Let's get into it. The second half was phenomenal. Wait, hold on. Sorry, not to like get into this already, but let's just tease this for a second. Is this the second half of a book that you like? Because last time you were saying that you have an issue with second half of books.
Yeah, no, I love this. Like, I don't know. I loved everything about this book.
Happy.
I thought it was just like so good. I feel like I just said that and just didn't have a lot to back it up.
I really challenged you there. I got aggressive.
You're like, prove it. Show me receipts. I'm like, I don't have any
evidence. We're gonna analyze this with data points. Brutal.
Okay, what's happened, Heather?
That's why no one wanted to be my friend when I was little. Okay. Anyways, sorry. Okay, so last time we left off, Mayumi had rejected Tatum, and that's where we ended in the first half. So after this rejection, the time kind of speeds up a lot, and this novel ends up spanning many years, during which Tatum and Mateo continue this like strange relationship that we talked at length about last time. And Tatum keeps working as a TA at the school, and Mateo keeps plugging away, arguably like passively, because he never seems to be really working on this book, but essentially he's throughout this time plugging away at his next novel. Remember that Like Happiness was his debut. And during this period, like a lot of other things happen. I don't think they're as important as like this big reveal, but I'll name like a few things. Like Tatum meets a model named Hiroshi, and they quickly build this relationship where they move in together, which means that Tatum finally moves out of that nunnery that she hated. But this relationship actually ends up ending when Tatum discovers he's an addict, which is really sad because Hiroshi seemed like a really great guy in all other ways, but he just had this demon that they obviously wouldn't be able to get past. Another thing that happens is Mateo gets engaged to one of his, I think Tatum calls them marketing executive women, that she always kind of typecasts as one specific person, and he's always in these affairs with. But he meets one that he falls in love with, and they get engaged, and Mateo invites Tatum to come meet her. So she's like the only woman that Mateo's ever been with that she's ever met. And she ends up like bringing Mayumi because she doesn't want him to meet Hiroshi, which I thought was kind of interesting. Mateo also has a reading in San Antonio where he meets Tatum's mother, and Tatum has breakfast with her father then, who expresses concern over their relationship. This is a really brief moment, but I did think it was like interesting to bring up because Tatum's parents aren't really discussed at length, barely at all throughout the book, besides the fact that like her mom is really Catholic and always wanted her to like find a good job. But this is kind of like a rare moment. We're getting a glimpse into their own psyches. Mateo also ends up breaking off this relationship with the woman who he's engaged to. The relationship between Tatum and Mateo hits their plateau when Mateo finally finishes his second novel. But then when Tatum buys a copy, also side note, why the fuck did she have to buy a copy if they're presumably best friends? But that's a whole other subject. She reads it, and she discovers that the entire book is essentially a story that mimics her relationship to Mateo from like beginning to end. And it's done in a way that really condescends the woman in the relationship. And in the present timeline, remember this is a dual timeline piece, which is 2015 when Tatum's living in Chile with her girlfriend. She's giving all this information to that New York Times journalist who's doing a piece on Mateo, and she gives him all of this information, and at the same time she's kind of unpacking all of this trauma and writing her own account of what happened in what I think is a letter to Mateo, and that's kind of where this ends. I don't actually remember the very last moment of the book. Do you remember exactly what happened?
Oh yeah, it was a moment from Cape Cod, and yeah, I thought this was good. Like it ended with her saying, "Mateo, I whispered, don't ever move." It's just like this moment where they're sort of like on the beach and sort of embracing, and that's where it ends.
Right. That was very poetic. Well, Nat.
Yeah. Okay. So one overarching thing for me here is like the story of abuse, right? We start with it, we end with it, and it really feels like it's been the backdrop. But what's interesting for me is that we don't ever really go into too much detail about what exactly has happened, right? There is that moment where Jamal's like playing a recording for her, and she stops him. And he's like, "This is only the beginning. There's so much more." And she's like, she doesn't want to hear it. So like that was really interesting to me, that even though, you know, we're supposed to sort of read this entire book with that context, we'll never really know what happened. And I thought that was a really effective tool. Like it's helping frame how to read some of these experiences that are happening, and how to like form an opinion of this man without the nitty gritty of it. And I was just curious, like, what did you think of that sort of like strategy and tactic at play here?
I agree that it was so effective. I think it also just plays up the fact that like this entire book is Tatum's recounting of everything that happened. And I think a lot of times what happens when, you know, a man of power is grooming a bunch of women, which it's very obvious that, you know, there is, and I feel like I need to back up for a second. There is a moment when, after Tatum is kind of like unpacking the book and she starts to realize, wait, maybe this isn't only just about me. Because she starts to remember, because at first she reads it, she's like, this is word for word our relationship, like moment to end. And then as she kind of has time to like digest it all and think about it, there's all these like little gaps in the book that are like, well, that didn't actually happen to us. And there was a moment when he had been on the phone with another woman, he called her Mavita, or he had always said that she was the only one he ever called that. And I think that there's this glimpse into the fact that the whole time Tatum thought that she was the only one, that she was like special because Mateo made her feel special. But I think he made all these women feel that way.
I agree with that reading. It feels like she gave that phrase like so much meaning. And it's interesting because he started using it like from early on, like from their first few emails or something. He like immediately started calling her Mi Vida, like based on, and I'm butchering it too. Like I don't, you know, that's so interesting to me that she believed that part. And I think that goes back to, you know, that intensity of control over her, that, you know, she was willing to believe that their bond was so strong that he knew immediately, and it has been the same for this 10-year period. Even when he's engaged to someone else, he's holding her as the most important woman in her life, even though, you know, they don't see each other very much and all of that. And it just like goes to this, the strength of his manipulation and his power over her in that moment, right? Or over this 10-year period, right?
Yeah, it's very dark.
Yeah, and like I also wanted to say, like, it's really interesting to me how, again, we're talking about, you know, last episode we talked about the sort of contradictory aspects of Tatum's experience. And I think another big one for me is that the reason she's gravitated towards Mateo is that she felt validated by him. Like in her first email to him, she says, you know, your work was affirming to me, right? To her sort of lived experience. And that's so wild because he's affirming her sort of socioeconomic experience, her sort of cultural heritage, that aspect of her life. And at the same time, over this 10-year period, he's invalidating everything else about her. Like, as a woman in this relationship, right? Like, he's downplaying her sexual preferences. He's downplaying her other relationships that she has. He's making fun of them as being fetishes. What else? Like, there's just a whole series of ways that he's invalidating and gaslighting her. But that first moment of validation has held such, like, it's just held her for so long. And she repeats that at the end. She says, he's shone a spotlight on me when I needed it the most. It's almost like the rest didn't matter, right?
It's interesting that you mentioned the fact that the two things that he validated were like her socioeconomic status and then her identity, because there's these two moments where she actually kind of, it's almost like a moment where she started to see that like maybe that was a bit of a ploy as well, because, and I'm going to like misarticulate exactly what happened, but there's a moment when he makes a comment to her Mexican American heritage, and she's like, oh, it's weird that he said that because that's actually more true too, and it was like a different type of Latina experience, and she thought it was weird that she would akin that to her. And then there's another moment too when he's saying something about her family not being able to do something, and she's thinking like, why do I have to explain to him that I'm poor? And those were the two things that she had kind of latched onto with him, and he kind of invalidates those in other moments as well. So it's interesting that it's like, it almost seems like his entire, everything that he's putting forward is a bit of a farce. I don't know if his lived experience is exactly the same as like Tatum's is.
That's such a great observation. Like, it's fabricated, right? His like validation of her, it's like taken from, it's like, okay, so there's this moment at the end where she says that one of her favorite stories from Happiness was La Monica. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. But she's like, who's that based off of? Whose story did he steal in that? So even though she felt seen, it's not that he saw her. He was just sort of like taking someone else's story in that way.
He was just ripping off everyone. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly right. And then so with that, it makes sense that, you know, he's invalidating like other parts of her sort of heritage and her experience, because he's like, he doesn't get it. He just took it and he just put it in his book. Like that's sort of my understanding of it. Yeah. So that was a really like interesting little like nugget at the end there that we like figure out that even, you know, it was all fake.
There's so many little nuggets through this book, and I love that about it. Even at the very beginning, she mentions like some of her favorite authors, and I think like David Foster Wallace comes up, and she's like, that's before we really knew about David Foster Wallace. And that was like its own little nugget, and that was like probably in the first chapter. Like it's all very, she has a lot of like Easter eggs, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about one thing that really struck a chord for me was that moment when Mateo offers to pay off Tatum's student loans. Student loans is like such a like universal experience, I think, that like is very crippling for a lot of people, and Tatum has like $30,000 of it. Like that's a lot of money for someone who's working as like a teacher's assistant in New York, where like cost of living is really high. And Mateo one night is asking her how much she has, and he's like, I think he's asking her like, what would it feel like to be free? And she's like, honestly, freedom, like to not be in like student debt anymore. And he's like, well, how much do you have? She says $30,000. He goes, okay, I'll give you 10. Actually make that 20. And I think like on their next meeting, he takes out his laptop and he's like, here, key in your like student loan information. And just like that, he pays off $20,000 of her student loans. And she's kind of like, I don't know how to thank you. And he's like, don't worry, you'll be able to like repay me one day, just not with money.
Yeah.
What did that mean? And also, why didn't he just pay the full 30? Like if 10, 20 was nothing, like what's another 10? Like, was that a part of like still weighing her down like a little bit? Like what did you think of him paying them, not paying the whole thing, the whole like, oh, you'll owe me one day? Like, I'm very curious to know your thoughts.
That's really interesting. Like, why 20 and not 30? Do you think maybe there's an element of, well, maybe he'll pay the rest of the 10
Oh,
later
I didn't even
and
think
sort
of
of like
that.
stringing her along. But also like his financial situation is really strange to me. Like on the one hand, his place she says like looks like a college dorm, and then on the other side of it, like he's taking like first class everywhere and flying her first class too, and then has these like great hotel rooms, and like I don't know, maybe he just has a lot of points. So I don't really know what his financial situation is. Like you can be an author and a best-selling one and not be, you know, super wealthy. So I don't know. It's not very clear to me. It might just be like fake there too.
I had seen someone on Goodreads like express how annoyed they were by this because they're like, no one who's an author, and exactly what you just said, like unless you're like Stephen King or J.K. Rowling, like you don't have a ton of money like this from your books. And at first I did also think like, it's weird, like where is he getting all this money from? But then with that moment with Tatum when she's like, why do I have to explain to him that my parents are poor, I start to think that maybe he had family money that he kept hidden because it worked better for his image. Do you know what I mean? Like he wanted to create this like narrative of himself. And if you have parents with money, like that doesn't fit as well as it does for someone like Mateo, who's like, I came to America with like only so much money, and you know, I climbed my way to this success. Like I do wonder if there's something else there that we just don't know. And I only say that because of that one moment with Tatum. It did feel like a little bit of a, he should know this, and yet he doesn't, because it's not from being an author, no matter how many talks you're doing.
Like I want to talk about the other man in her life, Hiroshi.
I loved Hiroshi.
I felt like she treated him like shit.
She did.
Like he seemed like a great guy, and it's a stable and healthy relationship as she describes, but I feel like, you know, she's still so in Mateo's grip or whatever that she just can't like see Hiroshi. And I know that, you know, he's like struggling with addiction, but like one part of this book that really bothered me was this moment where he goes to the Kafka Museum and she's like judging him for, you know, just saying like, oh yeah, it was cool, but not having like a really articulate thought, or, you know, I don't know what she was looking for, like something interesting to say about it, right? And I was like, for me, that goes back to how, you know, she's like in this really contradictory space where she's judging and othering certain people, but then feeling judged and othered by other people. So yeah, in that moment, I was just like, because that's really classist, and you know, to think that every single person should be able to analyze our history or have like a strong developed point of view. I feel like that's not everyone's experience, and just being so judgy of, you know, a person's quality as your significant other, just like linking that so strongly to how well they can talk about Kafka is just, I don't know, I found that annoying.
Very. Not even just how well they can talk about it, but even like the desire to. Like Hiroshi went and was sharing like something that he liked. Like, isn't that a part of like any relationship that you've chosen, whether it's a friend or a partner? Like you share the things you like. You're like, I saw this movie, or I saw this piece of art, or this thing like made me think of you. And like that is an experience of relationships, and she's expecting him to like educate her, and maybe that goes back to her like teacher fetish that she kind of jokes about having. And it's disappointing because it does feel so, I mean, it is very true to, I think, like the experience of someone who's like in their early 20s, and I don't know, like I do feel like we are a little bit more judgmental of people at that time. A lot of us grow out of it. Someone like Mateo doesn't, and I do think that a lot of her judgment, I'm not saying it all comes from him, but like reading this book or knowing the way that he, you know, viewed their relationship at the end, he was obviously condescending to her throughout their entire relationship. We weren't necessarily getting that account, But like she was probably treating Hiroshi how Mateo was treating her, so it was probably this like trickle down effect. And also the fact that she didn't bring him to the engagement party and she brought Mayumi instead, like that's something I would have done when I was like 17, and you're doing this like as an adult. Like anyway, sorry.
Yeah,
I feel like you keep wanting to say
that's-
something, and
that's
I'm like,
so
end
true.
this.
No, I love that. Yeah, there's also this moment where like they're Tatum and Mateo are at the hotel room, and she asks Mateo to take her shoes off because she's like, Hiroshi would have done that, and like Mateo doesn't. He's like, take off your own shoes, like. But she's like, that's something like Hiroshi would do, and it's like, that's so interesting. Like if someone is like willingly taking off your shoes or giving you a foot rub, you don't kick them. You're like, this person's a keeper. It's amazing.
They had that tradition where she'd get into bed and she'd be like, Hiroshi, put my socks on for me, and he'd like come in and like put her socks on her feet because like she would go to bed earlier than him. Like, yeah, they had a good relationship, and I agree with you, she treated him like shit. Going back to the book, when Tatum buys it and finishes it and she goes through the acknowledgements, and literally he's thanking like just like arbitrary people, like everyone from his like dog walker to massage therapist to like his like local bookstore owner. Like she's like, and then I'm not in it. Like what a like crushing reveal. Like she paints him as her best friend for decades, because it spans, or at least like over a decade, and he doesn't even like mention her. Like to me that shows this book is an amalgamation of stories that he's stolen from a multitude of women. And like maybe if Tatum is his oldest friend, as his ex-fiance described her, maybe they have the most stories like quantitatively, and so maybe she does take up the majority of the book. But that to me just said that like this book is so many women and Tatum is just one of them.
Yeah.
What did you think of that?
That's a great point. I hadn't considered that. Yeah, you're so right. It makes sense that it's like a bunch of people kind of like pieced together. I also think that, you know, he's clearly showing his disdain for Tatum, right? And I think like he just thinks that like people like that think they're really smart and smarter than other people, and that they'll get away with what they're doing. So to me, I also thought that, you know, if he actually does like think so little of her, then maybe he was like, she's not gonna remember saying these things to me or doing these things to me. It's over a 10-year period, right? So there's that aspect of it too. Like maybe he just thought that she wouldn't realize it, and then maybe he thought if she did, she wouldn't care, because again, like he's been the controlling force in their relationship, and he's kind of made it to a point where she has to kind of let go of things, or like just kind of go with the flow. And maybe he thought that she would do the same for this. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I kind of saw it as the opposite, where like he had always intended to use her as writing fodder, and when the book came out, he didn't need her anymore, you know?
Oh yeah.
So I think it was actually a little darker than that, where he was just like, he knew that she would notice. How could she not notice that? One, she's like in a lot of the book, but then two, she's not in the acknowledgements. But it didn't matter to him because he had already gotten what he needed from her. And this maybe is the way that he was like, she paid him back. Like he was the material for his book. And maybe that, I also think that's why it took him so freaking long to write the book. One, because he needed more material, but two, he wanted, like maybe he did want that relationship to continue on a little bit more, a little bit longer, and he knew at the moment that book was done and in the world, like their relationship was done. That's that's how I took it.
That's a great point. And I think you're right. Like he is that brazen, because there's this moment earlier on where I love these little like Easter eggs, like early on, where you kind of look back and you're like, oh yeah, now it makes sense. There's this there's this moment where he says to her that his book isn't going so well. Like he's feeling really stuck and he's looking for a story to steal. And so he's kind of putting that out there, right? He's like, he's not trying to hide it. Like, I don't know. So yeah, maybe he just doesn't care. He's like, no one's going to believe you. You know what I mean?
So dark. So dark.
Yeah. Towards the end, her dad has this moment with her where he's like, are you happy? You know, like it's been like 10 years and he's kind of just been like, you know, it hasn't really become anything. Like, is this what you want? And that moment was really sad for me because, you know, over this period, like friends and family have said that to her over time. Like her other friend was like, you started out as just a fan, right? Like you are a fan. And like another moment where someone else is like, what does he want with you? You're just a college kid, right? And like her network or, you know, her social network is like trying to kind of raise these red flags for her. But just, she's just so like, she's not ready to see any of that. Yeah. Even when it's the closest people to her. And yeah, I think what really struck me was like how this is so true of these, you know, predatory relationships where isolation is how the control is effective. And yeah, so it was definitely like really hard to read in those moments. Like overall, like this is not a hard book to read. I feel like, you know, all of those like details of abuse, like we don't go into that very much at all.
It's not like A Little Life. In that
yeah,
sense.
exactly. But these, so these moments though just kind of remind you of that sort of psychological toll that is taking not on just her, but you know, her friends and family. Yeah,
that part broke my heart with the parents. Like she goes to San Antonio. She's there for one night. She has dinner with her mom and Mateo, and it's like this weird like interview the whole time with Mateo and like his and like that kid who's trying to get an ad from him, and like that whole situation is just kind of gross. Like sometimes it is the polite thing to do at times is say no to someone that you don't know as well, and to like, you know, prioritize the people that you're closer to, if that makes sense. But that is so typical of someone who's narcissistic, where they will prioritize what the outside world thinks about them as opposed to the people that they've like created established relationships with. That's like such a trademark. But that moment the next day when she's having breakfast with her dad, like they go for breakfast tacos. Also the part that the mom couldn't come because like she couldn't get her shift covered, like that broke my heart because that is just such a truism to their socioeconomic status. It's the type of job where you can't necessarily always get time off. So that part made me really sad. But then also when they're having breakfast together and exactly what we just said, that discussion with her dad, like that was the one moment that we have with her and her father, and he's just expressing this concern for his daughter, and she's not, you know, at that time she's not seeing it. She's about to leave to be whisked off with Mateo again, and just caught up in his life of glamour and this life of her being infatuated with him. Like it's really sad.
Yeah. Overall, I love this book.
It's a second
definitely
half.
Recommend.
Yay!
Oh my god, yeah.
You got your second half.
Yeah, and it's just so poetic the way it was written, the way it was structured. It was just like really well crafted. And I think I just like in general really enjoy these sort of introspective works.
Me too.
So yeah, I think that's my genre, where it's just like reflections, you know, a person just like telling you what happened, but then also just kind of processing it. Overall, what did you think?
I loved it. I loved it from the beginning. Like it was, like you said, like it like parts were difficult to read, but it was an easy read, and that like I never felt like I didn't want to pick it up. Like I was always excited for the time of the day when I would like sit down and be able to read it. It's her debut, like, so there isn't other works out there by her yet, but I'm definitely looking forward to seeing more by her. I loved it. 10 out of 10. 5 out of 5. I'm not sure what the Goodreads ratings are.
All right, sounds good. Well, thanks for reading with us, and we're going to take a little bit of a break, and we'll catch you next time.
See you at book club. Bye.
Bye.